Well, good morning, church.
I do not look like Billy because I am not Billy. What?
Sunday school is dismissed.
Oh, yeah. All right. Go on, get out of here. But I'm pleased to take up the next installment as part of the series of Where Are We Now? Where are we now? Once upon a time, there was a man who owned a successful wagon-making business. For years, his wagons were the best in the land. People came from far and wide to buy them. They were sturdy, reliable, beautifully crafted. The man took great pride in his work, and his business grew. As time passed, new modes of transportation appeared: the train, the car, the airplane. People's desires changed. They wanted faster, more efficient ways to travel, and fewer people bought wagons. But the man knew how to build wagons. His family had been making wagons for generations, and he saw himself as a wagon maker. We make wagons, he said to himself, and that's what we'll continue to do. Years went by, and despite the man's determination, his business struggled. His once thriving company began to shrink. Other businesses adapted, but his heart was set on wagons. One day, a young entrepreneur came to him and said, "Why don't you move into the transportation business? People still want to travel. You've been building beautiful wagons for years, but transportation has evolved. It's not about wagons anymore. It's about getting people where they need to go." The man thought for a moment, but he shook his head. "I'm a wagon maker," he replied. "It's what I know. It's who I am." Within a few years, the man's business closed in the middle of a transportation boom. Sometimes I think we get stuck in a rut, thinking about how the church can be a better wagon, when we should be thinking about how to transport the gospel in the land we find ourselves in. The times have shifted, and the times, in fact, are shifting. There are lots of different ways to describe this shift, but one of the most common is to compare the modern era and the postmodern era, or modernism and postmodernism. There are different ways of describing pretty broad features of the way generally we thought and approach the world over a long period of time. In the modern era, we, the world, writ large, believed there was such a thing as truth, and that truth could be found by reason and logic. We believed right and wrong were discoverable and universal. We were optimistic about the future. We respected the government and the experts and the religious institutions. It already feels like that's an era gone by, doesn't it? In this era, it made sense that we believed doing church right was a code to be cracked. It made sense that we read the New Testament like an architectural blueprint. It made sense that we knocked on doors to share the truth we had discovered that was packaged into a logical 5-step plan. In the modern era, when the main problem is a lack of knowledge or incomplete or incorrect knowledge, the logical antidote is to fill a wagon full of organized, sequential, tidy ideas and spread them to the masses. But this way of approaching the world didn't prevent 2 world wars. This way of approaching the world didn't prevent corruption in the government or scandal in the church. The promise of perpetual progress died among economic recessions and failed guaranteed pensions. We don't live and breathe in a modern era anymore. We have moved on. And it's an era that we call postmodernism. In the postmodern era, we, the world, no longer believe there is truth, but many truths, depending on your language, your culture, your experiences. We no longer believe that there's just one story to explain everything, because all-encompassing stories are usually used to oppress and to control. We believe there's many stories to reflect the fragmentation and diversity of life. We question whether technological or scientific advances always lead to good or to a better future, or if we should even expect progress at all. In the postmodern era, people tend to be less receptive to dictating, but a little more open to dialogue, less interested in statements about truth and more interested in compelling stories. They're skeptical of authority and one-size-fits-all answers, but celebrate diversity and community. And so, with the world we live in and the air we breathe shifting around us. We in this room now, not we the world, we the people in this room who are entrusted with the precious cargo of the gospel, we need to ask the question, are we in the wagon building business or are we in the transportation business? In a postmodern era, we won't find ruts that fit the wagon wheels we used to build. But if we're open to new modes of transportation, and if we adapt our forms around the core of our gospel business that we've always been in, we'll find that the gospel message actually travels the new roads and the rails and airways in surprising and life-giving ways. Show of hands, who feels a little uneasy about everything I've just said? Got one honest soul in the bunch? I don't feel super comfortable with it. I'm just calling it like I see it. I was going to say like it is, but that's a modern statement. We're in a postmodern world. Just in case this makes you feel a little uneasy, I just want to remind you this morning that we are not the first to be confronted with this question. We're not the first generations of Christians thinking about how to adapt to the world that's in front of us and that we live in. In fact, we need to look no further than the very first generation of Christians in Corinth. Paul's words from 1 Corinthians 9, he talks about adapting the gospel, and it goes something kind of like this. Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessing. These words, however, are not really about evangelism. They're not about how to share the good news with those who aren't yet followers of Jesus in the 21st century. It would be a tad bit hypocritical were I to stand here before you and say, times have shifted, let me offer you some propositional truths and a technique so that we can win as many as possible. There's more going on here. Just think about it for a second, okay? Think about it. We are reading somebody else's mail. Are you Corinthian? Anybody? Resident of Corinth? Of course not. We're reading somebody else's mail. And we're bringing to it our particular questions that was not actually written to answer. And so Paul's not writing a book on evangelism or on changing times even. He's writing pastoral guidance to a church in Corinth that is struggling with a host of different issues. What we need to do first then, to make any sense of this text, is to pay attention to what issue Paul is addressing and how he does it, in order to understand his approach and see if that might give us some insight into what we should do with the world that we live in. So come be flexible with me for a few minutes. Adapt your imagination to a time where there is no sacred, secular divide. There is no separation of church and state. Every part of life is sacred, touched and influenced by the gods. And at every temple, animals are being sacrificed to different gods, and connected to every temple is a restaurant selling that meat. And in every house where meat is being served, there's a very good chance it was meat that was sacrificed to an idol. And I want you to imagine, for just a second, imagine with me, how different members of the church in this time, all seeking to be faithful to the gospel, might respond differently to meat that has been sacrificed to idols. Just imagine a church all seeking to be faithful to the gospel, responding differently to the same dilemma. Imagine that. This is the issue in 1 Corinthians chapters 8 to 10, which is the big section in which we have our text for today. And the issue here is whether or not a follower of Jesus can actually eat meat sacrificed to idols. It's a pressing issue for us, isn't it? Paul begins 1 Corinthians 8 this way. He says, now about food sacrificed to idols. And then he lays out this thought process. I won't bore you with all the details, but it is a highly engaging read that I would recommend you undertake. He says this, "We know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is no God but one." That makes sense. Idols are nothing. He says this, "Food does not bring us near to God. We are no worse if we do not eat, and no better if we do." Okay, fair points, Paul. I think I kind of see what you're saying. But then he says this, "But not everyone possesses this knowledge." Some people, Paul reminds the church, might have been so wrapped up in idolatry before coming to know Jesus that they can't, even after giving their lives to Jesus, eat meat that was sacrificed to an idol and disconnect it from the worship of that false god. Not everyone possesses this knowledge, Paul says. So be careful that the exercise of your rights does not become a stumbling block for the weak. So let's jump from chapter 8 all the way to chapter 10, where he concludes this part of his instructions to the church. And he gives this specific guidance. He says, "Eat anything sold in the meat market without raising questions of conscience," since idols are nothing after all, right? So it doesn't matter. It's just meat. Good steak's a good steak. Doesn't matter which steakhouse you got it from. "But," he says, "if someone says to you, 'This has been offered in sacrifice,' then do not eat it. Because we refuse to participate in idol worship, of course. Our lives and our allegiances belong to another." And so Paul, in addressing the same issue, says both go ahead and eat meat, but do not eat meat. The way Paul works through this very culturally specific issue is to say it really doesn't matter, but what does really matter is if you are considering the other person. In the case of a brother or sister in your church, the issue is whether you will cause them to stumble in their faith. Are you thinking about them, or are you just thinking about yourself? In the case of your non-believing neighbor, the issue is whether you will be explicitly complicit in their idol worship. The core gospel message is not compromised, Paul says, by eating meat sacrificed to idols or by not eating meat that's been sacrificed to idols. The gospel is compromised by whether or not you consider the people around you. There is a difference between adapting and compromising. As Paul instructs the Corinthian church about eating meat sacrificed to idols, we see him adapting the gospel to one of the issues of the world that he lived in. The gospel can accommodate meat eaters and non-meat eaters alike. But the gospel cannot accommodate self-centeredness, because that runs against Jesus, who is the gospel, who sacrificed himself for others. So this teaching that's not about evangelism turns out to be all about evangelism after all. It's all about Paul, who, having been evangelized. Do you guys know what the word evangelism means? It's kind of disconnected for us. We say gospel and evangelism, and they sound totally different, but they're deeply connected. Evangelism means to good news. It means to good news. It's a weird verb to us. Paul has been good newsed by Jesus. Yes? Paul has been good newsed. He has been evangelized. And he lets that good news guide every facet of his life. And this is what gave him freedom to adapt the gospel to each new context. In response to whether or not to eat meat sacrificed to idols, Paul's adaptation of the gospel to his context follows Jesus' example of self-sacrifice. If what I eat causes my brother or sister to fall into sin, I will never eat meat again, Paul says, so that I will not cause them to fall, because that's in line with Jesus' example. The eating meat is irrelevant. My consideration of the other is everything. And despite having the right to be paid, here we go. This is right into the center. Here's what Paul says in chapter 9, sandwiched between chapter 8 and chapter 10. He says, despite having the right to be paid by the Corinthians for his ministry work among them, Paul again models Jesus' example of self-sacrifice. Just like these are some of the examples he uses. He's like, aren't soldiers, don't they have the right to be paid? Aren't vintners, people who own vineyards, don't they have the right to the grapes? Aren't shepherds, don't they have a right to the harvest? I'm presumably wool, milk, maybe meat. Aren't temple priests deserving of being paid for their work? And of course, Just like all those, Paul and Barnabas had the right. But Paul chose tent making. We did not use this right, he says. On the contrary, we put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ. I have not used any of these rights, Paul says in chapter 9. And so as we watch Paul work his way through this meat sacrifice to idol thing, through a long and winding road, we start to see that some forms are flexing around a core gospel message. I find it really interesting that Paul didn't always refuse financial support. Did you know that? Paul didn't work exclusively with his hands to support his ministry. In fact, we know of at least 2 places in Scripture where he accepted gifts, one from the Macedonians and one from the Philippians. But Paul refuses any financial support from the Corinthians. What is going on? I think that Paul adapted the gospel to the Corinthian context. Corinth was a wealthy city obsessed with upward mobility. To state the caricature very boldly, more money, more status, more freedom to do whatever I want, whenever I want, with whomever I want. As a traveling philosopher teacher in the first century, Paul had options available to him, how to support himself. There were lots of models to pick from, legitimate options. He could charge for his teaching like the sophists did. He could attach himself to a wealthy patron. He could beg like the cynics did. Or he could work at a trade and support himself. Where most traveling teachers in his day would choose option 1, charge for their teaching, or 2, pick a wealthy person to sponsor them, Paul chooses the last option because he feels compelled by the free gospel of Jesus to stay out of the Corinthians' power games, even at great personal expense. He felt compelled by the freeing gospel of Jesus to show them true freedom, allowed him to choose the hard road for their sake. So he adapted the gospel to their context by modeling a life of downward mobility against cultural norms, who even while being an apostle, did not consider his position to be used for his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, humbling himself. Does that sound familiar? When Paul writes, "To the Jews I became like a Jew. To those under the law I became like one under the law. To those not having the law I became like one not having the law. To the weak I became weak." He is not describing a wishy-washy, people-pleasing, spineless approach that just twists and distorts the gospel message. Rather, he's embodying how a gospel-centered life flexes outward forms in response to his context in order that he might save some. Whether the issue was a religious one, like eating meat sacrificed to idols, or a practical one, like getting paid, Paul was guided by Jesus, by the gospel. And in order to save as many as possible, he adapts his gospel life and gospeled words to the context he finds himself in. And so should we. If you're interested in moving beyond making wagons and into building cars and trains and jets for the transportation era that we're in, if you're interested in moving away from replicating external religious forms and into building gospel bridges with the people who live in this time and in this place, here's a few considerations from Paul's example. First, and this won't surprise you at all, become gospeled like Paul was gospeled, good newsed, evangelized, wholly given over to the way of Jesus. No other identity even comes close for Paul. Even though he was an exemplary Jew, in Philippians he writes this, "I was circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. In regards to the law, a Pharisee. As for zeal, persecuting the church. As for righteousness based on the law, faultless." That's a tall CV. That's a long set of credentials he's got. But he so fully identifies with Jesus now that he says this, "To the Jews I became like a Jew." What are you talking about, Paul? You are a Jew. And he would say, no, I am in Jesus. He is so fully in Jesus that he considers himself an outsider who needs to adapt to the Jewish way of life. Is that not absurd? I find it fascinating. There is no allegiance, church. There is no allegiance that even comes close to our allegiance to Jesus. Not our sports team, not our job, not our school, not our city or province or nation. And in this season right now, the election season that we're in, especially not your political preferences. To be gospeled is to say yes to King Jesus first and last. Everything else is negotiable. The kind of allegiance Paul models for us is not pie in the sky, but boots on the ground. It's the kind of allegiance that would rather be wronged than exercise rights at the expense of someone else. It is the kind of allegiance that prays for enemies even while dying at their hands on the cross. That's our allegiance. I hope you knew, Maggie. That's the story you said yes to today. For the rest of you who've been walking it for a long time, that's the story you said yes to. That's the king you said yes to. Being good news for Paul means patterning one's life after Jesus. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, he says in chapter 10, do it all for the glory of God. Do not cause anyone to stumble, whether Jews, Greeks, or the church of God, even as I try to please everyone in every way. For I am not seeking my own good, but the good of many, so that they may be saved. Follow my example, as I follow the example of Christ. If we are going to build gospel bridges, we need to continually become ever more gospeled people. People who pray like Jesus, who study like Jesus, who walk like Jesus, who talk like Jesus, who serve like Jesus. Secondly, wherever possible, let's remove barriers. Again, Paul could adapt the form of the gospel to different contexts because it's what God did in Jesus, quite frankly. The incarnation, that is, God becoming flesh, the embodiment of the divine gospel in the person of Jesus, is Paul's model for how to share the good news in the world. Because God became one of us, Paul can become like any one of us. Paul sometimes ate meat sacrificed to idols, and sometimes he didn't. He accepted financial support from churches sometimes, but not others. He expected one protege, Timothy, to get circumcised so as to not offend the Jews, and he expected his other protege, Titus, to not get circumcised so as to not offend the gospel. He railed against idols in Thessalonica and in Corinth, but not in Athens, as you heard Billy talk about last week. I can give you some guesses, but I can't give you all the answers as to why in one place he flexes and not in others. But what I can say with some certainty is that Paul paid attention to his context, and he prayed to his Lord as he discerned how to adapt the gospel in order to save as many as possible. In my 30 years or so associated with this church, and specifically this church building, we've seen a lot of different changes. We've adapted in a lot of different ways. We've gone from hymnals to overhead slides to PowerPoint. I've seen us go from a full gym to a gym with garage doors to a gym with a curtain. I've seen us go from a worship space full of pews and orange shag carpet. If you don't believe me, look up there after service. We still have a sample. To much more functional chairs, a little more comfortable and tiled carpet. We've gone from an a cappella worship led by a single person to one led by a praise team to no praise team, to instrumental and a cappella worship. Maybe you've noticed some of the changes Jonathan pointed out this morning as Janessa and Billy and Jonathan and Ryan walked through the building and tried to look at this with fresh eyes. We're trying to remove barriers in order to save as many as possible. We can adapt forms, and we have adapted forms because at our heart we are gospel people who want to share the gospel blessing no matter the cost to us. And let me suggest that in addition to the building that we also rearrange some of our internal furniture. Let's keep moving from judgment to welcome. Pretty much anywhere in Scripture that I read judgment, it's not so much on the world. If it's the world being judged, that's Jesus' business. The only place I'm supposed to turn any sort of critical eye is towards my brothers or sisters, and that's always in love, and only after the log's out of my eye. From judgment to welcome. This is, after all, Jesus' posture towards us. We didn't start as friends of Jesus, but as enemies. And while we were enemies, he welcomed us. So if we're going to be gospeled people, we should probably take a cue. He didn't point a finger of judgment. He offered a hand of grace. He invited us to sit with him, to walk with him, to be with him. And in his presence, we saw our need for grace, and we accepted his offer of grace. Jesus welcomed us, and it changes us. I think we've been pretty good at welcoming new visitors in this space. That's one of the consistent little bits of feedback that we always hear is that, man, you're so friendly. Let's keep doing that. Keep it up. Let's keep introducing ourselves, inviting them to lunch, and building relationships. Let's keep being this curious community that welcomes everyone like Jesus does. And if we see people who may have left the fold for a while, and they're coming back, let's respect how hard it is to come back. Let's not greet them with a terse or accusatory, "Where have you been?" But instead with a warm and grateful, "We've missed you. Where have you been?" There's some internal furniture that we need to rearrange as we let the gospel seep into us, work its way through us and out of us. Proclaiming the gospel is more than words. It is the flesh and the blood that speaks the words and that lives the words. I love this quote. It says, "It is not merely the preaching of the gospel per se that is important, but the preaching of the gospel through a messenger who incarnates its message, such that the hearers can both understand it clearly for one who obviously empathizes with them and can see what it would look like if it took root in them." This is what I mean by letting the gospel into you and rule over you and live through you and work its way out into the world. I'll share just one last story from my own journey. As we practice this welcoming space, here's one way it's played out in my life. For those of you who know my family, you'll know that my father's an alcoholic, and that he is a recovering alcoholic for many decades now, and for that I'm very grateful. Very grateful. But it means that I grew up in a household where, the devil was bad and alcohol was worse. Okay? That's the household I grew up in. To touch it was to, you're cut off from the family. My dad never said that. It's just what I felt. And so that's the way I grew up. And quite frankly, I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful because it saved me a lot of headaches in high school and in college in my younger years. When I went to grad school, and probably even a little before that, I was introduced to this whole idea of incarnation. Why don't we enflesh ourselves, become like the people we live among in ways that don't contradict or contravene the gospel so that we can share this good news with them. And so I was working at a construction site in Estevan. And we worked hard, 10-hour days, 4 days a week, jackhammering, in case you're thinking we were slacking off for the weekend. Needed that to recover. My hands did this for the first 5 or 10 minutes of the day until I could finally flex them all the way open. No word of a lie. And when working with some of these very hard people, I discovered they were going out on Wednesday nights, the second last night that we were out on site, to the bar. And I was like, "Oh, can I come?" Because you want to be like the people that you're with. I was like, "I'm not going for drinks, but I'll make sure you get a safe ride home. I'll drive you." Don't know if that had anything to do with it. But I find it really interesting that out of that workplace, I performed 3 different weddings, despite living in Calgary with them being in Regina. The way you embody the gospel matters, church. I'm no superhero. I just decided to take Jesus' call seriously. Living up in Coventry Hills, just in the northeast, our first little starter home, I noticed across our back alley, one of our neighbors, somebody moved out, another person moved in. They had bonfires every Friday night and just got sauced, which again, not my cup of tea, just for the record. But I wanted to go hang out. And so the permission to go hang out, have a beer. I tell you what, I can milk a beer for a long time. Because I wanted to live with the people. I wanted to live with the people so I could know the people, see how the gospel worked it out. One of our neighbors, Al, who used to walk his dog around while he sipped on presumably coffee, we all knew it was not coffee, all day long, passed away. And he basically had no family and there's no formal funeral. And so this guy across the back alley arranged a gathering of some neighbors. He said, Mike, I know you're pastor. Will you come say some words? You want to talk about opening doors, church? We need to adapt our forms, flex it around the gospel core so that we can share the good news that we have experienced in Jesus in real, tangible ways. The world that we live in, that's around us, is full of skepticism and division. And we are the people who in our very bodies hold the good news. Are we willing to live like Jesus, to live like Paul, to adapt our forms, maybe even forms we cherish, for the sake of a lost and dying world?